cómo llegar, ¿no? Pero por ahora estamos enfocados en...
Okay, we are connected now. We are on live. Embajador Carlos Vázquez, Peruvian ambassador in Singapore. Good morning. Morning, over. We have also Ambassador Jorge Abarca del Carpio, Peruvian ambassador. Okay, we are connected already on live on Facebook. So, Ambassador Diana, Ambassador Madrap, shall we begin? Professor Metcalf, Professor Mohan, shall we begin?
Go ahead, Diana.
Okay, okay, bien. Manuel, ¿estás ahí?
Sí, profesor.
Ya, entonces...
sí. Listo. Okay, first, welcome everybody. First, to the Turkeys that are joining us today, this afternoon, and all the professors that are going to present here. And also, welcome to everybody that is watching us from our Facebook page. Today, this afternoon, we're having a special event. We're going to have two presentations. But first, let's give some words. Let's hear some words from our ambassador of Australia here in Peru, Ms. Diana Nelson, who is going to tell us some words to start this event.
Ambassador Nelson, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Aquino and the Centro de Estudios Asiáticos. As a country that straddles the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the Indo-Pacific concept is at the forefront of Australia's strategic policy thinking. And the reason is simple. It's a region that will have the greatest impact on Australia's future security and prosperity. Our partnerships with Indo-Pacific democracies are of first-order importance to Australia in achieving this outcome. And India, in particular, is a country with which we share common values, and it sits in the front rank of our regional cooperation. In fact, Australia, India, and Peru are all free and open democracies, champions of international law, supporters of an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, and firm believers in might is not right. From Australia, it's my pleasure to introduce a friend and former colleague, Professor Rory Metcalf. Rory has headed the National Security College at the Australian National University in Canberra since 2015. And in fact, Rory and I joined the Australian Foreign Ministry together a few years ago. It's also great to see another colleague, Professor Raja Mohan, again, an old friend of mine from an earlier posting that I had in Delhi, India. And in fact, it was Raja Mohan who suggested to us many years ago that perhaps India, Australia and Japan should consider a trilateral dialogue, and the result is now history. So from my point of view, we have no two better speakers this evening who are more uniquely qualified to speak to the theme of the Indo-Pacific. So thank you very much, and I very much look forward to hearing your presentations this evening. Thank you.
Okay, next we have the ambassador of India here in Peru, Mr. Subarayudu Mandarapu. He's going to talk about, he's going to give some introduction words too. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor Carlos Aquino, Ambassador Diana and diplomatic colleagues, Dr. Raja Mohan, Dr. Rory Metcalf, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to professors in Australia and Singapore, and good evening to all in Peru. At the outset, let me commend the Center for Asian Studies and its coordinator, Professor Carlos Aquino, for active promotion of dialogue on contemporary issues of global importance. I am glad that the focus of today's session is on a geographical space that houses over 64% of global population, contributes 60% of global GDP, and contains maritime trade routes through which about half of global trade happens. Even happier aspect is that two most eminent scholars with in-depth understanding and outlook would be analyzing certain dimensions of the concept called Indo-Pacific. There is global attention on challenges, opportunities, partnerships, and future associated with Indo-Pacific. Memories of listening to Professors Raja Mohan and Rory Metcalf at the University of Western Australia 6 years ago, during my earlier assignment as Consul General in Australia, are still fresh with me. Both have written and spoken extensively on the region, and I look forward to their analysis. My colleague Diana mentioned the relationship and cooperation between India and Australia. I would like to focus a little bit on India's approach. Friends, India's approach focuses on a free, open, inclusive, and rule-based Indo-Pacific. We emphasize respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, peaceful resolution of disputes, avoidance of use or threat of use of force, and adherence to international rules and laws. India recognizes that unity and centrality of ASEAN must be a key element in developing an Indo-Pacific vision. As envisioned by Prime Minister Modi in 2015, India's objective is multifaceted engagement with all countries in the region and those with interests in it, encompassing political, security, economic, and social, cultural spheres, aimed at security and growth for all in the region. Sagar, which means ocean in Hindi. India will, of course, work with all in the region to keep the seas, space, and airways free and open, to keep nations secure from terrorism and piracy, to ensure that global cyberspace is free from disruption, and to ensure access to and responsible use of global commons. Taking the process forward, at the East Asia Summit in November last year, Prime Minister Modi announced the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, an open, non-treaty based, inclusive platform for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. This initiative is envisaged to be structure light and cooperation heavy. We are willing to partner with all countries to ensure fair, transparent, and balanced trading systems, and to enhance connectivity for national, regional, and global economic growth. The region is of utmost importance for India, given the Indian Ocean carries 90% of our trade and energy sources. In the context of forging global partnerships for mutual benefit, I would like to refer to India's collaboration with Peru in the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Our cooperation is towards issues like climate change, clean energy, and sustainable development. Before I conclude, let me just share how widely admired Professor Raja Mohan is for his incisive analysis and prescriptions on international affairs. As a professor, director, editor, analyst, etc., Professor Raja Mohan has been making most valuable contribution to the understanding of international affairs. His dear friend and colleague, Professor Rory Metcalf, is equally very well known in India and abroad and has been doing marvelous work. In India, the articles and views of both of them are followed with keen attention. I wish to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Raja Mohan and Professor Rory Metcalf and thank them for agreeing to speak to the audience in Peru on the shores of Pacific Ocean. Thank you. I look forward to their views.
Okay, so next we're going to have Professor Carlos Aquino, the coordinator of the CEAS, to give some another initial words. Professor Carlos?
Thanks, man. Now, just to first welcome again to Professor Raja Mohan, to Professor Rory Metcalf. Really, it is an honor for our center to have two distinguished professors, the best expert in this subject of Indo-Pacific that have so much relevance now in our world. And also, of course, to say thanks to Ambassador Diana Nelson and Ambassador Mandrapu Subarayudu that were very helpful in allowing us to contact these two professors. Just to say that the Center of Asian Studies of San Marcos National University just was created 2 years ago. It's a relatively new institute, but myself and another member of the center have been doing for some years ago some research in Peru. As you probably know, Peru is one of the Latin American countries that have more relation with the Asian region. Just last year, 47% of our export of goods went to Asia. And it is not only China, it's Japan, India, Korea, among other countries. Also investment from those countries is increasing every year. So we're very pleased to have these two distinguished professors. And before giving the words to them, I will allow myself to read just a brief CV of each of one. First, we will have the presentation of Professor Rory Metcalf, and then the presentation of Professor Mohan. Just a brief presentation of Professor Rory Metcalf. He will talk about the heart of the Indo-Pacific, why middle powers matter in United States-China geopolitical competition. Professor Rory Metcalf has been head of the National Security College at the Australian National University since January 2015. He has led the expansion of the college into policy engagement and future analysis, as well as executive development, education, and research. This has positioned the college as more than a think tank and as a widely trusted institution bringing academia and government to foster a more inclusive and holistic approach to Australian national security. His professional background involves 3 decades of experience across diplomacy, intelligence analysis, think tanks, academic, and journalism, including as founding director of the International Security Program at the Lowley Institute. His area of expertise is political science, defense studies, government and politics of Asia and the Pacific, and international relations. Now about Professor Raja Mohan. Professor Raja Mohan is the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He's an Indian national and has been involved with major think tanks in Delhi, including the Institute of Defense Studies. And sorry, I will move to the person that I'm not talking. Sorry, I was saying that Professor Raja Mohan has been involved with major think tanks in Delhi, including the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis and the Observer Research Foundation. He was the founding director of Carnegie India before moving to Singapore to take up his current assignment. Professor Mohan served in Indian National Security Advisory Board and was the Kissinger Chair in International Affairs at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. during 2009 and 2010. Among his recent books is Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. The area of interest and expertise of Professor Mohan are India foreign policy, ASEAN security, great power relation, and international politics and technology. So thanks again, Professor, for your kind participation. And please, Dr. Roddy Metcalf, you can have the floor.
Thank you very much for that, that very kind introduction. And it is a real pleasure to engage with an audience, I guess, on the other side of the Indo-Pacific. What I will do for the next few minutes is cover 4 key points. I want to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific as a concept and talk a little about how its history connects with the present day challenges, particularly engaging with or managing the attempts by the People's Republic of China to dominate the region, but also how do we manage particularly the dysfunction that we're seeing out of the current US administration. Secondly, I want to talk a bit about the contest for power in the region and explain how it is more than bipolarity. It's many players, it's many layers, it's multipolar, it's multilateral. Thirdly, I want to go to that key point about middle powers and in particular look at the role of countries like Australia and India. And of course, it's a debate as to whether India is actually a middle power, but I will let my, my dear friend and colleague Raja Mohan explain that one. And then finally, I'll talk a little about the relevance of this debate to your part of the Indo-Pacific, not only to Peru, but to countries of South America, middle players in their own right, and really the relevance of this to you. If you don't mind, I'm going to just share the screen for a moment to share a few slides that will help to, I guess, help to explain a little about what I'd like to do. So,
yes, Manuel, ¿puedes quitar ¿puedes quitar la presentación para que el profesor Metcalf pueda presentar la suya?
Okay, just let me know
Professor.
if you can you see this?
Yes, we see, Professor.
Can, great. So I'm going to just work through a couple of slides and just 4 or 5 images. So firstly, of course, this is this set of remarks is partly based on my recent book on the Indo-Pacific. I think you can see this image. Yeah, so here's the cover of the book, which is the same book in different editions, Contest for the Indo-Pacific in Australia. Indo-Pacific Empire is the international edition. And interestingly, I'm very pleased to say that just this week I received the Chinese translation of the book, which is actually published in Taiwan. It will be interesting to see whether it is allowed to be on the shelves on the Chinese mainland. But the book is an attempt to capture the history, the geography of the region and its relevance for power relations in the present day. Look, what I am particularly interested in is the idea of mapping the region, the idea of regional cartography and the way in which great powers have understood our region throughout history, because this has a very deep relevance and resonance for the strategic choices that countries have to make today. So in the book on the Indo-Pacific, I chart the history of understanding this 2-ocean region, because of course, there are still many voices who say, hang on, this is not really the Indo-Pacific. We're talking about an Asia-Pacific region where the Indian Ocean and South Asia really don't matter very much. The argument in my book is that in fact, throughout much of history, recorded history and even before recorded history, we really saw in operation a 2-ocean system. That is, the Indian and the Pacific Oceans connected through the sea lanes of Southeast Asia were in many ways a centre of gravity for economics, for commerce, for diplomatic and strategic engagement as well. And in fact, the second half of the 20th century, when we got used to this idea of the Asia-Pacific and temporarily separated the Indian Ocean from our conception of the region, this was the anomaly, and that is now ending, and we're returning to an Indo-Pacific era. Now, interestingly, if you look at the history of the Indo-Pacific, and we don't have time to go into great detail about that now, you would see that more often than not, there was this grand story of maritime connectivity that included, and I'll come back to that in a moment, a dimension that encompasses the Americas as well. This map that you can see is from the Australian Defence White Paper in 2013. And that was, in fact, the first official document of any government, as my friend and colleague, Ambassador Nelson, would know and would remind you. It's the first time that any government declared the Indo-Pacific officially to be its region of strategic interest. So in many ways, although other countries, particularly Japan and India, played major roles in redefining the region in this way in recent years, it was initially an Australian government that put an official stamp on this. And the importance of this map is very simple. It captures a sense of the maritime trade in the region, including, but not only, energy, because this is partly a story about energy and resources. And what's significant is that it reflected how clearly the rising economies of East Asia, China, but not only China, also the very substantial economies of Southeast Asia, of South Korea, of Japan, and others were so deeply reliant on the Indian Ocean for their economic well-being, for their sea lanes of energy and other trade to Europe and beyond, and also the deep enmeshment of the American continent with Asia across the Pacific, and really the idea that this was one connected system of commerce. And of course, as you can see, the relevance of all of this to Australia, putting us much closer to the front line of connectivity, but also of geopolitical competition. Now, in the book, I do, as I warn my students, I do explore history and cartography quite extensively. And I think what is really fascinating is the way in which the region was imagined, the mental maps, imagined by decision makers, by merchants, by diplomats, by governments throughout history, and how more often than not, we really saw a two-ocean region as the norm for maritime Asia, and a maritime Asia connected with the world. And so just as one example, which I use in the book, this classic map, one of the first reasonably accurate maps of the region from the colonial era, and this is a Dutch map from 1570, captured a very clear sense of a two-ocean system, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, all as one maritime zone of particularly commerce, but also strategic interest. Interestingly, there's even a little hint of Australia on this map, and the map maker wrote the word beach there, so they knew something interesting about Australia even in those days. But what's, I think, more important from your perspective is that the American continent is identified as being really part of this system, even in the early colonial era in 1570. And in fact, of course, as your audience would well know, much of the connectivity of European empires into maritime Asia came via the Americas, not only via the Indian Ocean. So moving forward through history, and then just to get to the present day, one of the fascinating ways of understanding the Indo-Pacific from an Australian perspective is that this is a definition of our region where our country automatically belongs. And there have been long debates in Australia about whether Australia is an Asian country or not. In a sense, those debates become a little bit academic when you look at the map, and particularly when you look at the map in an original way, as you can see on this slide, an Australian explorer, Thomas Mitchell, did in 1848, where he sought to capture an impression of Australia's lifelines of economic and strategic connectivity to the world. And this is a map from 1848 that is just as relevant today. Again, South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia, all in one frame, India, China, and so forth, all intimately connected to Australia's economic well-being as a trading economy and as a country that is enmeshed with its region. But what really intrigued me about this pivoted way of understanding the region, where we don't exclude the Indian Ocean, is that it's actually consistent with the way China is now thinking and behaving. And much of my book is about how we deal with Chinese power and with Chinese attempts to really, in my opinion, exert an unhealthy degree of dominance over the wider region. This map on the other side of the slide is a 2013 projection of a world map by a Chinese state mapping authority. It's a map that is apparently very popular with the Chinese Navy. And its significance is that I think it reflects a few things. It reflects, firstly, the centrality of the Indian Ocean to a Chinese worldview. This is not just a worldview where China is at the center of the global system. It's a world where the connectivity, the sea lanes, the resources of the Indian Ocean are going to be central as well. And indeed, Antarctica figures prominently. What's also interesting is that this map was issued the same year that the Belt and Road Initiative was released, unveiled by China. In other words, this map, I think, reflects in many ways the world as imagined through the Belt and Road. And what's perhaps fascinating for your audience is the way in which the American continent is treated in this impression, in this projection of the world. Of course, China wants to cast the United States of America to the very periphery of global affairs and basically does that quite literally on this map. So we shouldn't read too much necessarily into maps, but they are, as I argue in my book, mental ways of understanding regions and the international system. They help governments decide where should they allocate their resources, which countries are their partners, which countries are their adversaries, what capabilities should they develop, where do they project their diplomacy. And I think they give you a clue to understanding geopolitical dynamics. I'll stop the screen share there and I'm just going to finish my remarks before I hand over to my colleague. So look, the other 3 points that I wanted to cover, firstly, there is in this two-ocean region, this interconnected Indo-Pacific region, very much now a contest for influence. And as you saw from that Chinese map, it's not a contest that is confined to the narrow boundaries of China's eastern periphery, the eastern coastal waters of China. We hear about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan. We know that these are flashpoints, but at the same time, it's now a much larger playing board of strategic competition. And the Belt and Road, as I argue in my book, particularly the maritime Silk Road, is essentially the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. So when you hear Chinese diplomats complain they don't like this term, the Indo-Pacific, because it seems to privilege India and exclude China, in fact, China is living the Indo-Pacific through its very own strategy. I argue that this is not just a US-China contest. In my country, there is, I think, sometimes quite a crude debate that everything is about choosing between America and China. America, our strategic partner, China, our trade partner. In fact, of course, it's a multipolar region. And India, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, a number of other very substantial countries in our region, middle players, maybe not middle powers, but middle players, are now working very creatively through their diplomacy to build new arrangements, new coalitions that give us agency so that we're not simply prisoners of, again, Chinese power and American dysfunction, or from time to time when America does still reflect its better characteristics, American power and agency too. And I do think that an interesting point for our discussion session is maybe what role the United States is going to play in this region in years to come. Part of this middle power response to the many layered contest for power and influence in the Indo-Pacific is about what is now popularly known as minilateralism. In other words, the middle players, particularly the four that I've mentioned, Australia, India, Japan, and Indonesia, but others as well. The French, for example, are quite active in the region. The middle players are not only strengthening their own capabilities, their own ability to set limits to Chinese influence and to support a constructive US role in the region, but also increasingly we're seeking safety and solidarity in numbers. Yes, this region has institutions, the East Asia Summit, the other ASEAN-centric institutions, but we're clearly not putting all of our faith in those. And instead, we're now self-selecting in small groups that in some ways reflect and leverage this Indo-Pacific geography. So the idea, for example, of Australia, Japan and India, which Raja may speak about, the idea of the Quad, Australia, Japan, India, the United States, new dialogues of Australia, India, France, Australia, India, Indonesia. These are all pieces of the puzzle where we're now seeking solidarity with partners. At the moment, it's primarily about sharing strategic insights, but increasingly, we're likely to see quite creative and constructive diplomatic endeavours with a material edge to them. For example, on supply chain security, on maritime security cooperation, on access to one another's defence forces, on COVID pandemic response, which of course is going to come into our conversation. And these won't be substitutes for example, our alliance with the United States. They won't be substitutes for multilateralism, but they will be enablers of those other layers of the regional diplomatic response to the age of disruption that we now live in. I'm going to conclude with a couple of points about, particularly about not only Peru, but really middle players, middle powers everywhere, whether it's in South America, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia. And that is that the Indo-Pacific, while it's a geographic system, is also very much connected to the global system. I think it seems to be an unusual paradox, but I would argue this is the global region because the Indo-Pacific is defined by those sea lanes, it's defined by connectivity. Every substantial trading nation has a stake in, and a legitimate stake in, the stability of the Indo-Pacific in a rules-based order, in non-coercion, in the sovereignty of small and middle states, as well as the rights of large powers. And that's why I think we don't need to have sterile debates about what are the exact boundaries of the Indo-Pacific. It's a maritime region, and therefore I think in many ways the boundaries are fluid. The boundaries depend on the interests of countries that are engaged at the time. What does this mean for you and what can you do? Look, I think I would probably have a similar conversation with European partners who are increasingly engaging in the Indo-Pacific. I don't think we are realistically talking about a hard strategic edge to the role that countries in your part of the Indo-Pacific will play in the core of the Indo-Pacific, which I think is Southeast Asia, the sea lanes of Southeast Asia. Instead, it's really a reflection of the many-layered nature of strategic competition in the region, the fact that geoeconomics, that efforts to use economics for influence, the fact that the rules-based order and the issues of norms and the rule of international law, the fact that there is a narrative edge now, a very strong information warfare edge to the contest for influence in the Indo-Pacific, and including a technology edge. All of these dimensions, the non-military dimensions, if you like, are going to be just as important in determining whether we can achieve a stable order where the rights, of small and middle powers are respected. And that's where I think you have a legitimate voice, and both individually and collectively, you have influence that you can bring to bear on the outcomes in the Indo-Pacific. And indeed, much of this will relate to the way in which countries everywhere learn to manage Chinese power, learn to manage Chinese influence within their own societies, within their own political systems, and to build, I guess, what we want in Australia, which is a relationship with China that is about mutual respect and about clearly defining the limits to influence that come with mutual respect. I'm going to stop there. I hope I've left enough time for my friends and colleagues, and I'll join the discussion shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Professor Metcalf. So Professor Raja Mohan, please, it is your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And really, I want to begin by thanking you, Professor Aquino, for hosting us for this very interesting dialogue. I also want to thank you for connecting us to so many of my previous friends and whom I have worked with. Rory, of course, and Ambassador Diana was in Delhi, so we had continuous interaction with her. I also had the privilege of interacting with Ambassador Subbaraidu in Perth, where he was our Consul General, and also in Delhi when he was in the headquarters of the ministry. So it's really wonderful to be engaged with colleagues in Peru, and I hope this is the beginning of a expanded interaction between those of us in one corner of the Indo-Pacific with other countries in South America and in Latin America. I think we also already see an expanded interest from that part of the world. Canada these days is taking a view of what the Indo-Pacific might be and how they would like to engage. So India certainly would be eager to step up the broader framing in which we engage with strategic communities, scholars, and of course the governments in South America, those who face the Pacific coast. I just wanted to say that how much easier Rory has made it for me because we share so much that he's cleared a lot of ground, and it makes it much easier for me to supplement and complement some of the things he said by looking at India's specific case in the Indo-Pacific. Firstly, on the question, is India a middle power? I would say, you can say, given its size, and many would want to treat it as a great power already, but I would say modesty and realism would demand that India sees itself, and I think that's how India sees itself, as a middle power, perhaps as the largest of the middle powers, and with the greatest potential over the longer term to become a major power or a great power in the international system. But for the near term, I believe, and I'm sure many in India also see it that way, that India's near-term future is in stepping up, in expanding cooperation with other middle powers, whether it is France in Europe, or whether it is Japan and Australia in the East, or with other countries in other parts of the world. So therefore, this is for India, then it is the middle power combination of bringing them together is very important at this juncture. That also brings me to a very important point that Rory has made, but I want to reinforce it, which is the title of our seminar today talks about US-China rivalry, the geopolitics of the US-China rivalry and the Indo-Pacific. But I want to make it clear that the region, that we in the region, are not seeing the current dynamic as a consequence of US-China rivalry. That is, we must be clear about the cause and effect. In fact, the region has an independent, long history of dealing with China. Many of us also have a long and independent history of dealing with the US. But this is not what's happening in the region, is not a consequence of what is now seen as US-China rivalry. Because we in the region have seen US-China relationship evolve in multiple phases. There was US refused to recognize China, PRC, in the early part after the Second World War, and then we have US and China deeply connected, deeply integrated, and today we are seeing another phase where whether it is economic decoupling or whether it is strategic contestation have begun. And as Rory pointed out earlier, that Australia was one of the first countries to talk about the two oceans and the Indo-Pacific. And before them, it was Prime Minister Abe of Japan who actually framed the idea of a two oceans in a contemporary sense. And then Indonesia was one of the first countries to embrace it, and India came in later. So you can see that the US is really the last one to accept the notion of Indo-Pacific. So we are not following the US, but in some ways, we are setting the pace, and I think others are beginning to see the problem, because our dynamic, our engagement with China and the US is not a reactive one, but of a complex dynamic that is emerging. I also want to reinforce another point Rory was making about the interconnectedness of the two oceans. He's shown it in the modern age, how it has evolved. If we go back a little to the past, in the late medieval or ancient era, Indian influence stretched till way into different parts of Southeast Asia, including especially Vietnam and southern China. And Chinese have had an influence and interaction with the Asian countries. So the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Pacific were deeply interconnected. And the idea that these two are separate zones was really a construct of the post-war situation that emerged in Asia. Because if you even go to the heart of the Second World War, if you see in the Second World War, I mean, for us in the region, there was a theater called the Burma-China-India Theater. The Burma-China-India Theater in the Second World War was formed after the fall of Singapore, when British had to retreat from Singapore and Malaya under Japanese occupation. The Japanese sat in occupation of Burma, took the Andaman Islands, were bombing the Indian eastern coast and of Sri Lanka's eastern coast. And it was the combination of British India, the Indian Army was central to it, America, which came in and built roads connecting Eastern India to China, and the Chinese Nationalist Army that worked together to defeat the Imperial Japanese occupation of Burma. And it was the Indian Army that actually led the rollback of the Japanese influence, and supported by the US and others. And it's very interesting to know, out of the nearly 1 million soldiers that participated in the Burma campaign, about 800,000 were from Indian Army, and the rest, actually, a lot of them came from Africa, East Africa, and other British-speaking colonies. And in fact, there was one Mr. Obama in that army. He was the grandfather of the US president, who would later become the US president, who joined the British Army African contingent as one of the supporting staff for the armed forces. So that tells you something about the interconnectedness of the region as recently as the Second World War period. So therefore, what we're seeing is actually a restoration of those connectivities because of the rise of China, the expanding influence of India, and the consequences that is having on the nature of the region itself. So the geography of Indo-Pacific in that sense is a reconstitution, as Rory said, of the natural relationships, of physical geographic relationships between the two oceans. And eventually, as the region engages the Pacific side, this is going to further expand. So that brings me to the question of India's role in the balance of power in Indo-Pacific since the Second World War. As I said, in the Second World War, the Indian Army, 2 million Indian troops participated in the Second World War. And it was the Indian Army played a critical role even in the First World War. And if you look back at that era, these early first half of the 20th century, and through much of the 19th century, it was resources of India that provided stability and security to what is now you can call the Indo-Pacific, stretching from Africa to South China Sea, and it was also the center of economic globalization under the British Raj. So the structure where in India that was deeply connected to the world, of course, under a colonial or an imperial framework, but nevertheless, within that framework, Indian capital, Indian labor, Indian entrepreneurs had quite an expanded role in much of the Indo-Pacific. So it's not just India was a post office to London, but Indian resources, India had an agency and contributed to the creation of the post-war world. And as our Prime Minister Modi often points out, in the two world wars, the Indian contribution to the two world wars has been forgotten, partly because of India itself chose to turn its back on it. But today, we reclaim that history and India's role in founding the post-war system and defeating the fascist powers, and in creating structure of the UN. Today we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN. India was a founding member of the San Francisco Treaty. It was a member of the Atlantic Charter. It was there in the early efforts at creating a rules-based order in the post-war period. But that brings me to the second phase of the question of balance of power, where India actually pulled out of this globalized system, starting from the 50s under Jawaharlal Nehru, who, I mean, it's not to criticize him or to take issues with the past, but the fact was the economic strategy that India chose of turning inward, of strengthening itself, and actively disengaging from the imperial economic globalized structure that emerged. That was a strategy. I mean, most Asians at the time believed would be better, would be faster route to development. Everyone was in love with the Soviet economic model at the time. There was no Asian who was not. The question is who corrected how quickly, but that's a different story. So the dissociation of India from the rest of Asian globalization had a negative impact on India's weight and role in the region. The second, India, because it was also reacting to the imperial security role under the Raj, India also dissociated from the security framework of the British Raj in the West, if you will, and because India was now focused on non-alignment, India withdrew from a security role that it had. So much of the history of the second half of the 20th century in Asia was, how do you fill the vacuum left by India on the security side? So the creation of SEATO, the creation of five-power defense arrangement, a whole range of structures that were created in Asia to take the place of India and India's past role. Unfortunately, most of them ended up in a failure. SEATO didn't last, CENTO didn't last. And India's own concept of an area of peace that we could develop with China and other Asian powers also did not work. So the contradictions within Asia, within Asian nationalisms, between Asian nationalisms created conditions for conflict in the region. It's only with the rise of ASEAN, which returned to a path of economic globalization, which created a structure of internal cooperation that produced a stability and the American defeat of and the pressure on the Soviet Union saw the region come together naturally, and then followed by China's integration into the system that was led by the United States. So the China's rise, as opposed to the Civil War and the complexities it had before, was deeply connected to its participation in a US-led system of globalization. China was among, ASEAN was the first, the four Asian tigers, including Singapore. Then you had the ASEAN, then you had China. Later you see Indochina, Burma, and India all coming into the globalized structure that we saw transform the Asia and the rise of Asia as a great force. What we've seen that brings me to the third phase. What we've seen happen in the last few years is really the consequences of the rise of China for the region. Just a few years ago, the belief here in Singapore and much of the region was, look, China will be happily integrated into the structure. The Americans believed China will be a responsible stakeholder. And it looked like Deng Xiaoping's theory, where China's rise will be peaceful, China will resolve its problems with its neighbors, and China would be a part of a new community of Asian nations. Now, what we've seen happen in the last few years is a dashing of many of these hopes. That we've seen a China that is more assertive in its territorial disputes with the rest of its neighbors, not just with India. Today, we're in the middle of a major conflict in the high Himalayas. In fact, it started much earlier, I would say, in the South China Sea. But the disputes are long-standing. But what has changed is China's attitude, especially under Xi Jinping, where he's taken a very different approach rather than in comparison to that of Deng Xiaoping. And I think that has created a new framework. Now, it is the fact that there is a new sensibility in China that the power rightly, has increased relative to all their neighbors. So the problem is not just with the rise of China, but it's risen so rapidly that the gap between China and its neighbors, including the most advanced nation in the region, that is Japan, which was until recently the #2 economy in the world, the #1 in Asia, was replaced about a few years ago by China. And China today dominates the economy of the region, partly because of the US integration. Second, its military spending is the second largest. It spends more on defense than all the other Asian countries put together, at least the most of the middle powers put together. So what you have then is actually an imbalance that has emerged. Now, this imbalance could lead to two outcomes. I mean, I think one where the region accepts Chinese dominance and we simply create a new order, as the Chinese would like, a new Asian order with China at the top of the heap. Or alternatively, a more balanced structure where we ensure that the US stays in the region and where no country dominates this part of the world. The current struggle, I think, is really between these two frameworks. That what do? We simply accept China as the dominant power. Sometimes our Chinese friends talk about the US role in Latin America and say, look, this is like in the Western Hemisphere, rest of Asia should simply accept a China-led regional order in this part of the world. And I think this probably most countries would have accepted it, but for the fact that China's economic dominance has also been accompanied by an attempt at gaining territory unilaterally, whether it is in the Himalayas or in the South China Sea, whether it is dictate terms on economic development, that we see a problem and the reaction that has begun to emerge. And much of this reaction, the US was, as I said, was the last one to join this, because even today, I would think we can talk about it. US remains deeply divided, how to deal with China. Trump has one particular view. The Biden camp has a different view, probably. But the question of how the US deals with this is going to be important for the rest of the region. We have to live with the Chinese power. So it is not a question of we rely on, it's nice to have the Americans, but we're not going to keep them against the wishes, because you can't have a genuine balance without an American participation because of the size of the Chinese power. But the question is whether the US stays in or not. The rest of us in Asia, the middle powers in particular, need to build a coalition of their own so that we are not simply at the mercy of what happens between Washington and Beijing. That is, we want a say in how the structure is formed. We want a say in how the rules are formed in Asia. And it can't be simply a dictation of one power or a dictation by two powers. So therefore, the question of how the middle powers getting together, both in terms of influencing the other two great powers, is critical. And this is where I think India's own policy has evolved in the last few years. One, from the belief in the early 90s that India thought India could work with China in constructing a stable international system. The region wide has participated in a multipolar framework, whether it is the BRICS or other areas. That framework is under test because China dominates those groupings and China is dominating the region. So as the pressure on India mounted from China, both on a number of areas, I mean, I would say on the economic front, for example, our trade deficit with China is huge, and India is now struggling to come to terms with it. The China's attempt at destabilizing India's relationship with its neighbors is a problem. And China's economic infrastructure, economic policies, which leading to the growing political and, penetration of the political systems in our part of the world is a problem for India. So it's not a surprise that India was one of the first countries to criticize the BRI and offer a comprehensive critique. It's also one of the countries now trying to do some economic decoupling so that there's a balanced economic relationship, and to join other coalitions, both the Quad, where we work with the Americans, the Japanese, and the Australians, and also strengthen other plurilateral, minilateral, if you will, organizations that has included India, Japan, Australia, India, Australia, Indonesia, India, Australia, France is the most recent of those. So I think the need to create a minilateral mechanisms to complement what we do in the Quad has become critical, and therefore there is a larger role for the Indo-Pacific, for the middle powers in the Indo-Pacific. After all, you must remember that this region is not a bunch of small countries, I'm saying it in a metaphorical sense, in Europe, that simply accepted the US-Russia framework after the Second World War. Most of the countries in the region actually won their independence in the same period. So in Indonesia or in India, are not going to simply cede their sovereignty because there is a new hegemon on the horizon. Because even much poorer India and Indonesia in the 1950s, 60s did not say, look, we have no choice but to support either Russia or America, and that we have an agency of our own. So that was the source of saying, look, we are not going to be dictated to, we're going to pursue our interests in our own methods. And I think that remains important today as we deal with the emergence of a US-China conflict. We're not sure where exactly it will go, but within that. But it's also important, I think, to understand all of China's neighbors in Asia face a central tension. All of us want to benefit from China's economic growth. All of us know the geographic criticality of China in Asia and the East. And all of us need to live with China over the longer term. So there's no escaping from that. So it's not about containing China. It's about limiting some of the unilateralism of China. So while that is the central feature, but we also need to ensure against a loss of our sovereignty, loss of our freedom of action, and a new set of rules that are imposed by a new imperial power in the region. And that's the reason why that we need this middle power coalition where we work with other countries. As I said, all countries, from Japan to India to Africa, everyone faces this dilemma. And I think one way of reducing the tension is really to strengthen middle power cooperation so that our options increase in this complex world. Finally, I would like to conclude by saying that we have not, this is not about building a new architecture. I mean, this is not about constructing new, you already have APEC, you have ASEAN, you have East Asia Summit. Do we need to do a whole new set of institutions? I think this is really about recognizing the geographic imperative and creating mechanisms of cooperation across this region. As Rory said, overlapping mechanisms. I think nobody has the energy to create a new regional institutions today. But the thing is, how do we coordinate our efforts, middle powers, in these regional institutions? How do we work together to create conditions and to create alternatives for just merely saying there's only one way of building infrastructure. There's only one way of defining the rules of the law of the sea, that what we've agreed 40 years ago is no longer relevant, that I'm going to lay down new rules in the maritime or the cyber or other domains. So I think our future is deeply tied to significant middle power cooperation. And I think what India and Australia are doing is the beginning, and I hope together we can engage a lot more in the Pacific region, in the Pacific Latin America. And I hope this is just the beginning of that effort. And let me stop here and thank you again for giving us this opportunity.
Thanks, Professor Raja Mohan. Very, very interesting your presentation, as of course was Professor Rodi Medcal. I don't know if Professor Rodi Medcal wants to do some comments, or we can go to the question. We have several questions there, Freddy.
I think let's go straight to the questions, and I think we will both have a lot to say.
But before going to the question, just allow myself to take advantage of my position as moderator, just to do some comments and some questions. First, Professor Rodi Medcal, you very interesting your presentation. You talk about the maritime Silk Road. As you know, in Peru, you also referred to Peru and Latin America, when it was under the Spanish rule from the 16th century to the beginning of the 19th century. You have this famous Manila, Acapulco, galleon trade, okay? From big ships, they were bringing lots of goods, mainly silver, but also some agricultural goods, potato, tomato, to Manila, and then other ships went to China, Macau, and they bring from China, and not from China, from India, from Japan goods. But the interesting thing is now also Latin America is becoming more increasing, but what surprised me and many people is the kind of trade that Latin America had at that time under Spanish rule, and the kind of trade that we have now with China and Asia is nearly the same. During the Spanish rule, we exported just raw materials, mainly silver, agricultural goods. And now it is the same. So we exported raw material in exchange of manufacturing goods, and now it's nearly the same. Nearly 90% of what Latin America export, especially for Asia, and especially in the case of Peru, 95% of what Peru export to Japan, to China, to Korea, is just copper, is just iron, some kind of fish meal, and that's all. And what we got in exchange from China, Japan, India is manufacturing goods. So we have a very long trade with Asia in the 16th, 17th, at the beginning of the 19th century, but then it fell. Now we are again increasing our trade, but the nature is the trade it has no change. So many people in Latin America are worrying that we are repeating just the same pattern of trade. So something must be done about that. And then another thing that is also very interesting, for example, some people said that in this big competition between United States and China, many countries can be the battleground, can be the battlefield, or we have to choose between United States or China, okay? So, but another person said, and I guess you, Professor Budimir, have implied that we shouldn't do that, okay? We should, especially you gave a receipt for us, we should ally with some middle-income countries. And that is very interesting what you say, Professor, because in the case of Peru, what we have now, you know, I said before, 47% of Peruvian export go to Asia. But in fact, most of that is from China. Last year, 29.4% of all Peruvian export of goods went just to China. So 30 years ago, many people were complaining that we were too much dependent on the United States. More than 1/3 of our export went to the United States. And now some people are complaining, or not complaining, but not yet, are they saying we're becoming too dependent on China? And we know, you also, Australians know that when we're too dependent on China, something can happen. Really. So we need to diversify our export, really. So in that case, of course, the biggest task is our task, okay? We have to not only continue producing raw material, we have to move to produce more value-added goods. For that thing, for example, we're doing some kind of free trade areas. We have a free trade area with Australia, we have a free trade area with Japan, we have a free trade area with Korea, for example. And by the way, we're negotiating a free trade area with India, and also we want to begin negotiations for a free trade area with Indonesia, but the free trade area with India is going slowly. And that brings me to another question. I guess this is for Professor Raja Mohan. You said very interestingly that, for example, China have become a big power, not on the economic size, because 40 years ago, they opened to the world. Okay? They took advantage of the globalization. I guess, and also you know, your professor better than me, that the biggest winner of this globalization process have been China. So, you know, this is very ironic, really. You know, I am a professor of international trade and policy, and I asked my students, please, can you tell me who are the biggest winner of this globalization process? Ironically, are two communist countries, China and Vietnam. And the countries that complain of the globalization are the most capitalist countries, you know, United States, that's why they Trump and France and other countries. So this is very interesting. So Professor Mohan, you know, in 1980, China and India has about the same economic size. The GDP was similar. But what happened now? China GDP is at least 5 times bigger than Japan. Sorry, China GDP is at least 5 times bigger than India. So my question for you is this. You know, India was going to join the RCEP, okay, this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, but it seems India is not going to join that. It seems that by November, the following 15 countries are going to. So my question is India not missing again an opportunity is not letting the field open to China. China will consolidate its economic emergence, economic dominance in a sense in Asia at least. So this is my question for you. And also two other things before getting the comments about the famous Quad, okay? I have read, for example, that in October, the Minister of Defense of Japan, India, Australia, and United States are going to meet in Tokyo, okay? So it seems there are some voices that want to make a more institutional, this famous Quad, okay? Even some, I was reading in 1 week ago in one webinar, the Deputy Secretary of State of United States said that we have to think, perhaps in the future, making a kind of NATO alliance. It is supposed to contain China, really. But then there is another news that I read just some days ago. The Secretary of Defense of United States, Mark Esper, have asked the countries in Asia to increase, especially the countries that depend on United States military assistance defense, to increase the defense spend to 2% of the GDP. In Japan, I was reading just Japan have announced the amount of money that's going to spend in the next year military defense, and they have increased just a little, but still it is, within the 1% or below the 1% GDP framework that Japan has. So my question is, what's going to happen with this Quad? Is it going to become more institutionalized? There is going to be something like that. I don't see myself, but what's going to happen? What is the direction that is going to do? I'm sorry, my last question. What is going to happen with the next president? Supposing that if you suppose that Joe Biden will win, okay, it's going to be some change. The countries in Asia can expect some change about that. Those are my comment and question. I don't know if you answered now, because we have some questions also on the Zoom floor.
I might suggest, because there are so many other questions, I'm happy to try to address them all together when you're ready.
Yes, perfect. Yes, okay, I will read, Professor, I will read two questions so you can begin answer, okay? Okay, for example, we have a question from the Embassy of Peru in Singapore. What are the implications of the Indo-Pacific approach on Southeast Asia, taking into consideration the so-called centrality of Asia as the main platform of economic integration and diplomatic dialogue on the Pacific region? And just another question of Ambassador Diana Nelson. Could you comment on consequences of COVID, what this means for global supply chains and the continuing strategic and economic balance of power? Please, professors.
Okay, I'm happy to go first if you'd like, Roger, and I'll hand over to you. There's a lot of questions. I'll try to touch on a few of them briefly. I'll go first to that question about Southeast Asia. And, I'm a strong advocate of the view that, in fact, Southeast Asia, especially maritime Southeast Asia, is really at the core of the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, the geography puts Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and really the whole maritime Southeast Asia there. But diplomatically, I think ASEAN is in many ways a pivotal institution. And so I think it was very important that ASEAN developed a formal Indo-Pacific outlook. I think 2 years ago, it was very important that Indonesia in particular developed its own outlook. And it's interesting now that Germany, which is, I think, such an important state in Europe's own turn to the Indo-Pacific, Germany has acknowledged the ASEAN outlook as central to its own framing of the vision. I think that I think we should strongly resist the idea, which I think is an idea promoted particularly through Chinese state propaganda, that the Indo-Pacific is automatically a containment strategy. The Indo-Pacific is also an opportunity to build an inclusive regional set of structures that create space for China, provided that China respects the interests and the sovereignty of smaller powers. And that's where I think Southeast Asian countries have a vital role to play. Going to a few of the other questions, I think it's good that Ambassador Nelson has mentioned the COVID context. I think one of the really important dynamics we're seeing now is the self-selection among capable middle powers of supporting one another in their responses, not only to the pandemic, but to the economic and strategic consequences of the pandemic. So we will see, for example, a Quad Plus mechanism, the Quad plus 3 other countries, I think it's New Zealand, Vietnam and South Korea, coordinating their thinking on these issues. We will see, I think, Australia, India, Japan cooperating on supply chains. And I think we will see other new creative responses where we haven't even yet tested the boundaries of what's capable in building resilient alternatives to the established supply chains. There was a question about undersea cables, and I think it is very significant that Chile has selected essentially a Japan-Australia combination for so much of its information connectivity across the Indo-Pacific. And I think that reflects the choices that middle powers are making. We don't want to disengage from China, but we don't want China to have some kind of control or ability to hold hostage our connectivity to other parts of the region. There's a question about timeframes for middle power cooperation. We have to play a long game here. I think one of the critiques of the Indo-Pacific, one of the critiques of middle power cooperation is that we don't have time, is that time is on China's side and that we need instant results. I don't think that's true. And I think, in fact, we can play a 10-year game, a 20-year game. That's how long it's going to take to build the kind of resilience and the kind of economic alternatives that we need. And that goes to your question, Professor Aquino, about really economic alternatives for Peru and other countries in your part of the region. Of course, like Australia, we can't move away from a dependency on resource exports to China tomorrow, but we need to build more diversified, healthy economies anyway. We just need to begin the strategic, I guess, journey of doing that. To conclude, I think with one or two of your other questions, I'll just go to the question on the Quad and perhaps leave all the difficult things for Raja Mohan. On the Quad, it's not an Asian NATO. It's not going to become NATO tomorrow. It's about coordination, and it's about really identifying how we can support each other as one of a number of overlapping structures in the region. It is significant that the Quad has life and has growth. And I think the idea that Quad ministers are going to meet in person next month in Tokyo during a COVID era when travel is so limited really shows how rapidly the seriousness that we take this institution is evolving. But nobody is asking India in particular to become a military ally, which is something that India is traditionally not going to go along with. Instead, we're going to use the Quad as one of a number of ways of demonstrating to China that every step China takes towards coercion, there will be steps that other countries in the region take towards building their confidence and trust in one another. But in the end, none of this matters unless our own countries can build significant capabilities of our own. And that's why, for example, Australia's very significant defence investments over the next 10 years are worth examining. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, if I may just come in here, I mean, I think Rory has already covered a lot of the ground. One, I think on globalization, I mean, Professor Aquino, you are absolutely right that China has been the biggest beneficiary of economic globalization. But I think the part of the problem that the US is discovering today, that the US debate on China today, at least one lot says, look, they took China's professions of wanting to integrate, China's professions of peaceful rise for granted, and that probably it was a mistake. And unlike in Soviet Union, the Communist Party never left power, and in fact, it has consolidated even more. The second, I think, second part of the debate in the US, look, was it a mistake to have let China into the WTO in 2001? So that again is being debated in the US. That few had anticipated China would game the system to its unilateral advantage in the WTO. And I think that's what is the debate in the US. So Now, you can't undo the past, but the fact is China has risen. And the logic of decoupling is not really starting from the Americans or the Indians. I mean, because after all, it is Xi Jinping's idea of Make in India 2025, that China had actually blocked all American digital apps for a long time. So they see this, look, they've taken benefit from a situation, and now they want to turn it into a China-led system, not a participant in the global system. I think this is what, in hindsight, of course, it looks quite clear. But now for us, those of us in the present, we have to deal with the consequences of China's power. And I think there is no escaping that, both on the economic front as well as on the security front. Second, how did the imbalance between India and China come about? You pointed to early 19th century where India and China were equal. In fact, that was true actually until 1980s. Until late 1980s, the per capita and the GDPs were roughly equal and pretty low numbers if you go back to that period. But I think it is that connection with the US, the early liberalization of Deng Xiaoping, starting in late 78, and then a big boost after Tiananmen in 1990, that provided a dramatic transformation of Chinese capabilities. And I think and India joined the liberalization only in 1991. So it's a gap of almost 13, 14 years. I mean, that's a reality. Now, India is not going to do another China. I think we should also be clear. India is not going to do another China that you have the complete control of your internal system, that you can control labor, you can prevent any kind of protest that come out of any society. When you make rapid economic change, there will be political consequences. Different sections of the society will be affected. They're going to protest. But China had a way of dealing with it, and I don't think India can do it that way. So I think it's going to be different. India is going to do it at only its own pace. And linked to this is the fact that the US is no Western country today is prepared to accept another China that will simply game the system. So therefore, they're looking at a different arrangement of a recombination of how much globalization, how much industrial policy, how much of protection, that is state versus society, are going to simply leave. So those are big debates. I don't want to go into it. Latin America was always in the forefront of those debates. So I think we are in the, how globalization has operated between 90 and 2020 is going to be different. We've already seen Trump and Brexit. So that adaptation is going to take place. On RCEP, yes, I think India was an enthusiastic participant till the end, but I think the problem is that the question is if this is going to be a China-led economic order, India's manufacturing is going to take even a bigger beating, and therefore they had to step out. So the question now is not whether we join the RCEP or not, whether it is we can work bilateral and plurilateral trading agreements with countries like Australia, with Japan, with the US, Europe. That's one part. Second, Rory talked about the resilient supply chains. Are we going to join the supply chains with the other countries in Asia? At least there's some progress on the Apple and Foxconn shifting some of their production to India. But just probably one swallow does not make a summer, as they say. But I think it's a beginning that India needs to readapt, and a different framework of regional cooperation. That's what is likely to happen. In the question of US and Biden, I think the deep state, if you will, has moved, I think, whether it is the security establishment, they see clear and present the Chinese threat. But how the politics of it is going to play out, because Biden does emphasize more engagement with China on climate change, avoidance of a Cold War. So will they go back to an Obama-like policy? That is one concern in Asia. But many of our American friends say, look, there's not going to be major change, even on the Democratic side. But the fact is, whenever you have a new government in the US, a new administration, of course, there's always some disruption. But the trend lines of the last 20 years has been strengthening US position in Asia, but at the same time, trying to find the best means of engaging China. I think that problem, as I said, everyone has it. And I think we'll all have to deal with it along with the US. On Quad, I just have very little to say, but the fact is, look, there was no Asian NATO in the 1950s. It was always a separate type of, the hub and spoke system in Asia was different from the European system. So I don't think today Asian nations are bigger, stronger. They're not going to simply say, we're just going to join another NATO, or we're going to wait for it. And that's where I think, as Rory said, middle power coalitions, regional networks of security to complement what the Quad can do. So both are going to be important, while at the same time, keeping open a significant substantive engagement track with the Chinese. So it's going to be different. It's not going to be a replication of Europe of the second half of the 20th century.
Thanks, Professor. There is one question, I don't know if you have answered. They said, could you comment on the influence of this United States-China problematic relationship on the development of science and technology in India and Australia? I don't know if which of you comment on that.
It's a big question.
After you, Roger, you go first.
No, I think it's a big question, and I see China has made huge advances in the new digital domain. Is invested massively in the new technologies, including synthetic biology, a whole range of areas. But we also know that the US still remains one of the main sources of advancement in science and technology. So for India, at least, I think India's strategy will be to stay connected and engaged with the other powers, the other democratic powers, rather than shutting down cooperation in a manner that China is trying to do it, of trying to move unilaterally, having gained considerable ground. I think India's strategy will be India's significant technological capabilities, but we've also seen some of the Indian technology hubs like Bangalore, both on the bio side as well as on the digital side, are deeply connected to the US and other areas. And we've seen, for example, in the vaccine development, India is the place where production of at least one or two of the major vaccines that are likely to come is going to take place. So I think our strategy is to cooperate, collaborate, rather than do it unilaterally in a way that China is doing.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, we don't have...
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, look, firstly, on technology, science and technology is already one of the layers of strategic competition in this multi-layered game for strategic influence that both the US and China are playing, but that other countries are playing as well. And I think that what's striking is that our systems internally, certainly in Australia and I think in India too, are now adjusting to our policy-making systems, the relations between business and government, the relations between universities and government. This is all adjusting to this new reality. So we're in the middle of a phase of change. I do think that you're going to see a much stronger national interest focus in scientific and technological establishments in our countries. I think it's happening in Australia already. I don't think we want to make narrow choices between China and the US, but I do think in particular there will be a much greater scrutiny of technology collaborations with Chinese entities, because so much that appears to be purely private or purely academic often has a Communist Party edge to it, often has a degree of state influence. The only other point I'd note is that I do think that in the aftermath of this ongoing confrontation on the India-China border, there seems to be a strong change of mood in India regarding technology cooperation with China. I mean, Roger could comment more on that, but I do think that long-term, China has lost whatever trust it had in India, and that is going to be significant if we look at a 10 to 20 year period.
Thanks, Professor. We don't have a question in the Zoom room. I don't know if somebody in the Zoom room can make a question. If not, it is already 1 hour and a half. A long time, Professor.
Can I just jump in on the Trump factor, please?
Yes, please.
Professor Rapino, I know there was a question about if Trump was re-elected.
Yes.
So I think that one of the qualities of the Quad and the minilaterals that don't include the United States is that this is all partly an insurance policy regarding unreliability in the United States. I mean, I think we've got to remember how powerful America still is, despite the damage that COVID is inflicting, despite the damage to American credibility, I think, that President Trump has inflicted. But nonetheless, I still think we underestimate America in the long term at our peril. And what we need to do with institutions like the Quad and the trilaterals is create a context for constructive engagement of America in the region so that the US position over time competes with China, but does not confront China unnecessarily. And that's why even if Trump is re-elected, the Quad could be useful for Australia, India and Japan to present a kind of united front to the US administration about how we want America to engage in the region. We may or may not be successful, but I think that is part of the logic of the Quad. And of course, if we have a Biden presidency, which I think will focus more on competing with China than confronting China, again, the Quad becomes a useful mechanism for ensuring that that takes place.
I just want to add something to that. I mean, I think it also relates to the earlier question. Look, I think when US is not looking to pick up allies, I mean, they're not into a collection of allies. They want allies who are capable and competent. That if you take the next 25 years, I mean, I think they will be, I think we have to be prepared for, the US is not going to keep doing what it has done for the last 75 years. That it'll take most of the burden for securing the world. And it is just, others are just going to free ride on that. So Trump or not Trump, I think that argument that, look, others need to do more, while the US, how much US will stay, that is still a debate. But the fact is that we need to do more. I think that recognition, I would reinforce Rory's point with this, Australia, Japan and India, Indonesia, we need to do more to take care of ourselves. We need to come up with ideas. We need to come up with actions and not merely wait for the Americans to act. But then that is about living under the vagaries of what happens between Washington and Beijing. But I think that's what the whole Middle Power Coalition is about. I think that's been the central theme of our discussion today.
Very interesting, Professor. If there is no other question, if there is no one who want to make a question, I guess we're coming to the final of this very, very interesting webinar. Especially for me, Professor Raja Mohan, Professor Rory Metcalf have been very, very interesting. As I said before, Peru, not only Peru, Latin America, all over the world is increasing its relationship with Asia. Asia is already the economic power in the world, and it's going to assume, of course, more geopolitical importance. So it's very interesting to know how countries like India, Australia are facing, for example, a growing China. No? And also, one question that we have been asked in another seminars, for example, in this United States-China competition, there are urgent affairs. For example, what model will we choose for the 5G infrastructure? Are we going to choose Huawei? And if doing so, the United States will be not happy for that. Are you going to press for not choosing us that thing? So there are many issues that have to be resolved, and we are very thankful for you, Professor, for your insights. And we hope, Professor Raja Mohan said at the beginning, that this will be the beginning of an academic relationship also, okay? So I will write to you, Professor Raja Mohan, in order so our institution can have a more stable relation. Thanks again, Professor Raja Mohan. Thanks again, Professor Rory Metcalf. It has been an honor for our institute to be host of you, and also, of course, Ambassador Diana Nelson, Ambassador Mandarapu Subarajudu, for helping us to contact these two professors and our friends. I have seen the Zoom room several diplomats from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Peruvian ambassador in Singapore. So we are very thankful for all things. And I remember you that this conference has been transmitted online by a Facebook page of the Center of Asian Studies, and you can see it again. Thanks, Professor. Hope we have you again in our center. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And have a good
Very
day
well.
and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Diana Nelson. Thanks, Ambassador Bandera Pusubarí. Gracias, Carlos.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Great
much.
session.
Thank you.
Thanks all. I enjoyed it. Really useful. Take care.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Ambassador Raidu, Ambassador Diana, and Professor Aquino. Really delighted to connect with you all.
Thank you, Professor. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Muchas gracias, doctor Aquino.
No, gracias, ministra. Muy amable. Muchas gracias por atender.
Doctor, ya no estoy en Lima, pero
Ay.
ya recibí la invitación y le agradezco porque son los temas que más me gustan, ¿no? Ya estoy en Dallas, soy consultora.
Ay. Bueno, gracias a esta maravilla del webinar, del Zoom, podemos conectarnos. Encantado, nos podemos contactar. Y muchas gracias por atender.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego, cuídense. Hasta luego. Gracias, amigo.
Thank you, Professor, for conducting.
Ambassador, you're very kind. Thanks, Professor. Thanks for all the coordination. Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much for this very interesting
Thanks, Carlos. Nice
webinar. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
And I am here to reinforce the possibility of strengthening the relationships between your center and the Center of Asian Studies here in Singapore, from the National University of Singapore. Eso sería genial.
Yes. Vamos a hacer eso, Carlos. Muy amable.
Okay. Chao.
Nos vemos. Chao. Ahora sí, chao.